Over the years, we've seen the growing popularity of a specific anime genre, power fantasy. Whether you like it or not, people are always going to look for an escape. Whether you're like me and you just enjoy watching something warm and comfortable where you can turn your brain off, or you just want to watch a strong guy do the strong thing, the numbers themselves show that this is a genre that's very in demand. But because of a few really good shows, the number of these anime coming out every season has skyrocketed to the point where it feels like we're now drowning in mediocrity. But in winter 2024, we got the one power fantasy to rule them all, Solo Leveling, and I'm here today to tell you why Solo Leveling is the perfect power fantasy. Solo Leveling is about a world where random portals called gates appear, acting as pathways to these places called dungeons where all sorts of magical beasts and bosses reside. And people called hunters, not those hunters, are commissioned to go into these gates and take down the enemies. Every person in this world has some kind of magical power, and upon awakening, your level is immediately capped. You can never get any stronger. Our main character, Sung Jin Woo, is the lowest rank, but one day upon entering a low-ranked dungeon, everyone in his party is wiped out, and the few that do survive leave Jin Woo to die. And right before losing his life, he completes a secret set of challenges. He passes out, wakes up in the hospital, where he figures out that he and he alone has gained the ability to level up. He levels. Solo. Alright, pretty typical power fantasy video game stuff, right? But what sets Solo Leveling apart from other shows of this genre? For the sake of this video, I'm going to define power fantasy as a genre where the focus is on the main character becoming unreasonably powerful, being used as a wish fulfillment for the audience. So, although shows like One Punch Man and Mob Psycho have an extremely overpowered character who seemingly cannot lose, I would not consider those power fantasies because even with unlimited amounts of power, you still feel bad for them while watching. Alright, so if a power fantasy is more or less a story that's focused on a single character becoming unreasonably powerful, then why are they so hated? One of the biggest issues for me in these power fantasy shows is the immediate power spikes that occur and the immediate raising of stakes. Because in most of these anime, it's supposed to be a story of an underdog getting great power, which makes you want to root for them, but because they get immediately way too overpowered, it's just kind of cringy. And that's exactly where Solo Leveling excels when compared to the competition, because we see Jin Woo's slow progression. In a lot of power fantasy stuff, from the second we see the character get their abilities, the intensity of every scene is already set at max, which in turn makes all of the scenes feel kind of bland or boring. I think the perfect example of how to gradually do a power spike would be in Gurren Lagann, which I wouldn't quite put into that category of self-insert power fantasy, but I do think it's just about as close as you can get without actually being there. The very first scene in Gurren Lagann is a scene of our characters in this grand scale Star Wars-esque, Gundam-esque battle, immediately setting the pace for just how insane this story's going to get. But then it goes back in time when our characters were just underground. It then spends almost the entirety of the show gradually building up to that same level of intensity in every single fight. If the first scene was an 8 out of 10 on the intensity scale, each fight raises in intensity until the final fight breaks all expectations you have for the show, raising to a 10 out of 10 or even an 11 out of 10 on the intensity scale, which makes the journey you have to get to the ending feel so earned, which is exactly what Solo Leveling does so well. But it stretches out that initial hook over 2 whole episodes. After taking on the double dungeon and getting absolutely eviscerated by the giant statues, we see Jin Woo as he slowly levels up, and where the anime is at, we have yet to see a threat to match the one from the double dungeon, making you wait for that eventual rematch between Jin Woo and the biggest threat we've seen so far in this series. And once again, it's that gradual build up to that sheer devastation we saw in those first 2 episodes that keeps the viewers so engaged. Another thing that's needed to keep the audience entertained would be stakes, which although Solo Leveling doesn't do the greatest job at, I still think it's a step above most of these light novel power fantasies that we're used to. I also think it's important to mention that Jin Woo has actual goals that serve to move the plot forward, even if we might not know exactly what the end goal is. For example, in the Demon Tower arc that currently just ended in the anime, the goal was to try to create the elixir of life in order to save his mom. And throughout the whole show, there's always been this subconscious feeling of knowing that Jin Woo is going to have to get back to that double dungeon and take it on. Not to mention the mystery of the actual mechanics behind the system and just what exactly it is, and when compared to its competition, it's just miles more interesting than trying to become the strongest and get the most women. Of course, Jin Woo himself is also a big reason for the success of this show, because at its core, it's still semi a self-insert story, but Jinwoo is just cool. I would assume most men would want to be Jinwoo. He's just a cool guy going through dungeons, doing his own thing, getting stronger for his own sake, not doing it for fame and women like you see in all these other shows. I do want to mention that I'm not just stripping down power fantasy to a genre where someone gets overpowered for the sake of women and fame. But much like a lot of isekai reuse the same tropes to the point where they're the same story in a different font, power fantasies have a similar evolution and most of the time go hand in hand with isekai. I want to talk about the use of abilities in Solo Leveling, which I think set it apart from its competition in the genre. In my opinion, a character's abilities are much more interesting when there are actual rules and logic applied to them. For example, Cursed Energy in Jujutsu Kaisen. Although there are a wide range of abilities that all do completely different things, the rules that they adhere to are all the same, which allows for you to have a character like Gojo who can use Purple Hollow while also having Nanami who can create a critical hit point, with both having completely different strengths and weaknesses. And in a lot of magic-based media in and outside of anime, these rules and limitations don't really apply, and the magic kind of ends up just boiling down to being able to do quite literally anything because it's magic. But Solo Leveling also doesn't fall into this because of the unique power system only Jinwoo has access to. The system is basically just a video game menu where Jinwoo can level up and gain abilities, and upon gaining these abilities, the audience and Jinwoo are both immediately told exactly what the ability does and exactly what the drawbacks are. Series like Hunter x Hunter and Jujutsu Kaisen that are known for having the best power system get a lot of flack for the long-winded explanations of how abilities work, and people wonder if that's actually just good writing or exposition dumps. And although I am a fan of those two examples, it's just so much easier to understand Solo Leveling when it quite literally gives you a video game stat screen for every ability. They also do a great job at making these seemingly unbeatable abilities feel more like tools Jinwoo uses in his arsenal than a get-out-of-jail-free card, and at the end of the day, no matter how many abilities Jinwoo has, it always ends up in a beautifully choreographed 1v1 between Jinwoo and whoever he is taking on. Speaking of beautifully animated, the production on this show is insane and some of the best I have ever seen. If you compare Solo Leveling to other power fantasy anime, I'm not sure if there are any that look this good, and even beyond that, when compared to the entire industry, this show still stands out. Season 1 had above average animation, but the draw to the manhwa was always the insane art, especially since the original is a webtoon, and each chapter ends up feeling like one giant masterpiece of a picture, each part feeding into the next, and just making each fight scene feel insane. And I'm not sure if the first season quite did it justice, but now in season 2, this show's animation has reached a Mob Psycho Jujutsu Kaisen level. The best fight from season 1, Igris vs Jinwoo, which by the way is amazing, would be the worst fight from season 2. Let that sink in for a second. Aside from just the animation, the soundtrack and voice acting are both amazing, the soundtrack being done by Hiroyuki Sawano, who you might know from some unknown anime like Attack on Titan and 86, and the music just constantly elevates every scene it's in. The voice acting is just absolutely amazing, the biggest standout being Jinwoo in both the sub and the dub, and in general, I just think the production helps this show stand out above the rest of the competition. Not just in power fantasy, but anime in general. And after season 2, I think the anime is the definitive best way to consume this story. At the end of the day, I think the dominance of Solo Leveling comes down to two different things: the insane production of this show, rivaling even things like Jujutsu Kaisen, and Jinwoo himself. They took all the good parts of the power fantasy genre and built upon it by mixing in the shonen leveling aspect of it. And all in all, if I had to sum it up, I would say this show is just a whole lot of fun. It perfectly balances the line between awesome and cringy. As far as power fantasy goes, I don't know if there's any better.